Warning: do not ignore these signs. The universe will intensify things. The message that found you. Something brought you here. Not the algorithm, not idle curiosity, and not the kind of coincidence that the unprepared mind reaches for when it cannot explain what the awakened soul already feels. You did not stumble onto this video, you were led to it, and if you sit with that for a moment, truly sit with it without immediately reaching for an explanation, you will notice something already happening inside you. A recognition. A quiet, almost wordless sense that this message has been waiting for you specifically, and that it has arrived at precisely the right time. Not a day too early. Not a moment too late. There is a version of you that has been moving through recent days carrying something unresolved. A question, without a clean answer. A feeling that keeps surfacing no matter how many times it is pushed back down. A pattern in your life that you have noticed but not yet named. A sign you have seen but not yet been willing to fully receive. You may not have spoken about it to anyone. You may not have even allowed yourself to think about it directly, but it has been there, present in the background of your ordinary moments in the quiet just before sleep, in the middle of tasks that should have your full attention but somehow do not. This is not a coincidence. The universe that created the mathematics behind every star, that arranged the precise conditions for life to exist on this planet, that designed a human nervous system capable of love and grief and the specific ache of longing. That universe does not do accidents. It communicates. It has always communicated. And every soul that has ever lived long enough and quietly enough to notice has felt it. That unmistakable quality of a moment that was arranged, that carries a weight beyond its surface, that lands with the precision of something addressed directly to you. The signs have been sent. They have been arriving in your life in forms unique to you, in the specific language that your soul recognizes, delivered through the channels that your attention naturally moves through. And something in you already knows this. That something is why you are here right now, receiving a message that was always going to find you, because the universe does not give up on its own. It does not send one message and wait to see if you respond and move on if you do not. It is far more devoted than that, far more patient, far more intelligent in the ways it finds paths through every defense the mind constructs. What this video is going to give you is not new information from the outside. It is going to give you permission to trust what you have already been sensing from the inside. It is going to walk you through the full architecture of how the universe communicates, what happens when those communications are ignored, what the cost of that silence truly is, and what becomes available the moment a soul decides to stop looking away and start listening. You are ready for this. The fact that you are here is the proof. And everything from this first word forward is the beginning of something you have already been moving toward, even in the moments when moving felt impossible. The language the universe has always spoken. Before there were words, there was pattern. Before there were temples or texts built to house the understanding of something greater than the individual human life, there was the lived experience of the soul encountering what it could not explain, and knowing without explanation that the encounter was not random. This knowing is ancient in the most precise sense of the word. It reaches back to the beginning of human consciousness, to the first moment a person looked up at the night sky and felt, in the pit of something deeper than the stomach, that they were not simply looking at gas and distance, but were being looked back at. The universe has always spoken. The language it uses is not made of words arranged in sentences. It is a language of pattern, of repetition, of timing, of convergence. It speaks through numbers that appear with a frequency that cannot be attributed to chance. It speaks through symbols that surface across dreams and waking life, carrying the same essential message in different containers. It speaks through the quality of specific moments, through the particular atmosphere of an ordinary day that feels weighted with something it has no practical reason to carry. Every ancient wisdom tradition has recognized and named this language. The Hermetic traditions called it correspondence, the principle that the visible world is a reflection of invisible realities, that what moves in the cosmos also moves in the individual soul. The mystical branches of every world religion have preserved the understanding that the divine does not only speak in scripture and doctrine, but in the intimate and personal language of the individual soul's experience. Carl Jung, who brought the rigor of modern psychology to bear on questions previously reserved for mystics, named this phenomenon synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence that carries a significance far beyond what its surface content can explain. Angel numbers, those specific numerical sequences that appear with a timing and frequency the rational mind eventually finds impossible to dismiss, are one of the most widely recognized modern expressions of this ancient language. They are not the mind's pattern recognition system generating false positives. They are legitimate forms of cosmic correspondence, calibrated to the soul receiving them. And they are one dialect among many. The universe will use whatever channel the soul is most likely to notice. The song that plays at the exact moment. The book that opens to the exact page. The stranger's words that land with the precision of a message written exclusively for you. All of it is the language. All of it has always been the language. You did not learn it. You were born knowing it. Why signs begin small? The universe is not heavy-handed. The first communication is never a crisis. The first sign is almost always something so quiet, so embedded in the ordinary texture of a day, so easily explained away, that it could pass without notice. This is not oversight. It is precision. The extraordinary precision of an intelligence that understands the human psyche from the inside. It knows the specific resistance a loud sign would trigger, the defensive walls the mind would immediately construct. The small sign is not a lesser sign. It is the most calibrated sign, delivered at exactly the frequency the soul can receive without shutting down. Think about the first time the number appeared. Before it became undeniable, there was a first time, a single, quiet, unremarkable appearance. Perhaps something in you registered it as slightly more significant than it had any obvious reason to be. That slight registration was itself the first response the universe was waiting for, the first tiny opening through which the communication could begin to deepen. Because the universe does not need you to immediately understand the full message. It needs you to begin noticing. Noticing is the opening. Noticing is the first act of the dialogue being offered. The small sign carries something the large sign cannot because it requires something of the receiver that the large sign does not. It requires attention. The specific quality of awareness that notices the subtle, that pauses over the unremarkable long enough to feel into whether it carries more weight than its surface suggests. The soul that has developed this quality of attention, that has learned to slow down inside a moment, to feel its weight, to ask whether it carries a message before deciding it does not, is a soul in genuine, ongoing, reciprocal relationship with the intelligence behind the signs. The small sign also carries a kind of intimacy that the dramatic sign cannot replicate. When the universe speaks to you in the midst of an ordinary Tuesday, through the specific song at the specific moment, or the single number on a receipt that arrives with the weight of something personal, it is not speaking generally. It is speaking to you, in the particular, in the sacred ordinariness of your specific daily life. And that specificity, that quality of being seen and addressed in the middle of nothing remarkable, is one of the most profound experiences available to a soul living in a human body. The moment of the first dismissal. There is a specific moment, identifiable somewhere in every soul's history, when the first sign arrives clearly enough to be felt, and the choice is made to look away. Not dramatically, not with full awareness of what is being set in motion. The first dismissal is almost always quiet, wrapped in the language of reason, accompanied by a feeling of mild relief, the relief of having successfully re-established the familiar ground of the explainable. The mind is extraordinarily skilled at this. It is in part designed for it. Its primary function is to organize experience into patterns that support survival, and one of the ways it does this is by maintaining the coherence of its existing model of reality. A sign that falls outside that model represents a threat to coherence, and the mind responds with its defenses, rationalization. The number was a coincidence. The timing was statistical probability. The feeling was wishful thinking. These explanations are not dishonest. They are the mind doing its job. The problem is that the mind's job, in this specific domain, directly interferes with the soul's navigation. What happens in the moment of the first dismissal is more significant than it appears. The soul, which presented the sign and waited with patient readiness for it to be received, registers the dismissal as information about the current state of the channel between the soul's knowing and the mind's awareness. The channel in this moment is narrower than it was before. A small amount of trust in the soul's own perception, has been redirected toward the authority of the rational explanation. And while this single redirection is not catastrophic, it establishes a pattern. It teaches the mind that this is how it handles signs, and the mind, which learns from repetition, will apply that teaching the next time. Each dismissal makes the next one slightly easier. Each rationalization strengthens the neural pathway of rationalization. Each time the voice of inner knowing is overridden, it speaks a little more quietly the next time, not because it has become less certain, but because it has learned the cost of speaking at full volume into a space that is not yet ready to receive it. And the divergence begins. The slow, incremental separation between the life the soul is navigating toward and the life the mind is constructing from the available surface data. Over months and years, the gap widens. The life being lived and the life trying to be lived from the soul's deepest orientation begin to feel less and less like the same thing. And the universe, which has been watching the divergence widen, begins to turn up the volume. Escalation. When the universe turns up the volume. When the first sign is dismissed, the universe does not withdraw. When the second is explained away, it does not take offense. When the 10th communication goes unacknowledged, it does not conclude that this soul is unreachable. It escalates. And this escalation, this progressive intensification of the signs, is one of the most misunderstood qualities of the universe's relationship with the human soul. People tend to experience escalation as pressure, as the uncomfortable narrowing of options, as the mounting sense that something is trying to force a change they are not ready for. And because the mind has been conditioned to associate pressure with threat, it often meets the escalation with increased resistance, constructing more elaborate rationalizations, working harder to maintain the coherence of the existing model of reality against the increasing evidence that the model is incomplete. But escalation is not pressure in the threatening sense. Escalation is devotion in its most persistent form. It is the universe demonstrating, through increasing urgency and frequency, that it is not willing to let you miss what you came here to understand. The message it carries for you is important enough to the soul's path that it will continue finding new channels, new forms, new moments of convergence to deliver it, for as long as it takes, with as much intensity as the soul's current level of resistance requires. The Hermetic principle known as the principle of vibration teaches that everything in existence vibrates at a specific frequency, including the communications between a cosmos and the souls it contains. When a soul is not yet vibrating at the frequency required to receive a particular message, the message finds a way to raise the frequency of its delivery until the resonance is created. Escalation, understood through this principle, is not force. It is attunement. The universe tuning its signal to the frequency that will finally break through. This is why the escalation feels personal. When the signs have been ignored long enough, the universe begins using channels that are impossible to dismiss. Not a quiet number on a receipt, but the same number on every surface for days. Not a subtle resonance in a stranger's words, but a direct statement from someone who could not possibly know what you have been privately wrestling with. Not a gentle closing of a door, but the collapse of an entire structure. These are not punishments. They are the same message, delivered at the volume required by the current level of resistance, and they will continue escalating until the message is received. The signs hidden in your pain. There is a kind of suffering that does not make sense on its own terms. That cannot be explained by the circumstances that appear to have generated it, that seems disproportionate to its apparent cause, that persists long after the rational mind has declared it should have resolved. A grief that returns in the middle of ordinary moments. A restlessness that sits beneath the surface of a life that contains everything the mind said it needed. An ache that has no precise address, present consistently and undeniably like a quiet hum beneath the frequency of daily experience. This kind of suffering is not evidence of something broken. It is a sign. One of the most direct and personally addressed signs the universe sends, precisely because pain cannot be switched off or walked away from. Pain demands presence. Pain insists on itself in a way that more comfortable communications cannot. And the universe, which understands this about the human nervous system with extraordinary precision, uses pain as a channel when other channels have not been sufficient. The specific quality of unexplained or disproportionate suffering always points somewhere. The grief that will not resolve points to something not yet fully honored. The restlessness beneath apparent contentment points to an alignment not yet made. The ache without an address points to a longing the soul carries that has not yet been allowed to fully exist. The ancient wisdom preserved in the law of correspondence teaches that suffering at this level is never meaningless. It is always pointing inward, and through the inward pointing forward. The question it is asking is never simply, why does this hurt? The question is, what does this hurt? Know that you have not yet allowed yourself to know. Sitting with pain in this way, not medicating it, not resolving it prematurely into a narrative that makes it more manageable but less true, requires a quality of courage that is not often celebrated. But the soul that is willing to stay present with its own pain long enough to feel where it is actually pointing, rather than what it is surface ostensibly about, is a soul receiving one of the universe's most intimate communications. The pain is not the message. The pain is the envelope. And what is inside, when the soul finally stops treating it as something to be gotten through and starts treating it as something to be read, is almost always a sign of extraordinary importance. Synchronicity and the intelligence behind coincidence. In 1952, Carl Jung published a careful, rigorous, and ultimately revolutionary examination of a phenomenon he had observed across thousands of hours of clinical practice. He called it synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence of outer events and inner states, those moments when something happening in the external world corresponds with something in the internal world, in a way that carries unmistakable significance, yet cannot be explained by ordinary cause and effect. Jung was not a mystic in the traditional sense. He was a scientist, empirical, methodical, trained in the rationalist traditions of European medicine. The fact that he devoted extraordinary intellectual resources to the documentation of synchronicity is itself significant. What he found, across a lifetime of careful observation, was that these moments were not rare aberrations. They were frequent, structured, intelligent, and deeply personal. They appeared at threshold moments, at points of significant internal change, at the edges of major life decisions, in the middle of the kind of crisis that requires a new orientation to navigate. What synchronicity reveals at its deepest level is that the separation between the inner world and the outer world is not as absolute as the rational mind assumes. The universe is a unified field, a single intelligent system in which what occurs in the consciousness of an individual soul is in constant, dynamic, responsive relationship with what occurs in the events and encounters of their external life. Synchronicity is the visible seam where that relationship becomes undeniable. The intelligence behind coincidence is not random. When the book falls open to the exact page that addresses the exact question you have been privately holding, the mechanics of that coincidence are not reducible to chance. The intelligence that communicates through synchronicity does not override the laws of physics to deliver its messages. It operates through the laws of physics with a precision that makes those laws themselves the language. This is why synchronicities feel different from ordinary coincidences. They carry a weight immediately recognized by the part of the soul fluent in the language of signs, even when the rational mind simultaneously generates alternative explanations. That felt difference is itself data. It is the soul's instrument registering a frequency the mind's instruments were not designed to detect. The people who were sent to you. Of all the channels through which the universe communicates, none is more complex, more frequently misread, or more extraordinary in its potential depth than the channel of human relationship. The people who arrive in your life are not random. The specific timing of their arrival, the specific qualities they carry, the specific ways they challenge or illuminate or reflect something back to you that you could not have seen without them. None of this is accidental. It is orchestrated in a way that recognizes the soul's need for specific kinds of encounter in order to move through specific stages of its development. The soul contract theory, preserved across wisdom traditions and carried through the accounts of those who have glimpsed the structure of existence from the other side of physical death, proposes that before the soul enters physical life, it chooses its significant relationships. Not every person encountered, but the significant ones, those who carry specific lessons, mirror specific aspects of the self, catalyze specific transformations the soul needs in order to fulfill its chosen curriculum. The person who appears at the exact moment you needed to be shown something about yourself is not there by accident. They were sent. And the message they carry is worth reading as carefully as any sign the universe has ever placed in your path. The teacher disguised as the difficult person is one of the most powerful and most frequently missed forms of this communication. The colleague whose behavior triggers a reaction that seems disproportionate. That reaction is a sign. It is pointing to something inside you that is unresolved, something the soul has been trying to bring to your attention and has now arranged an external mirror for. The angel disguised as a stranger carries an equally powerful form of this communication, the 3-minute interaction that offers the phrase that becomes the key to something locked in you for years. These encounters are not manufactured by the mind-seeking connection. They are placed by something that knows where you are in your journey and knows precisely who you need to meet there. The relationships that end are also signs, perhaps the most painful and therefore the most important to read carefully. Inside the grief of an ending, when the soul is ready, there is always a sign, a specific piece of information about the kind of love or connection or community the soul is now ready to move toward, that the ending has created the space for. Reading the signs in relationships requires the willingness to ask not only what the other person is doing, but what the dynamic between you is reflecting about the landscape of your own interior. When your body becomes the sign. The body knows things the mind has not yet processed. This is not a metaphor. It is a physiological reality documented by researchers in neuroscience and somatic psychology, and known, in experiential terms, by every wisdom tradition that has attended carefully to the relationship between the physical self and the deeper knowing it carries. The body is not simply a vehicle for the mind. It is an instrument, responsive, intelligent, extraordinarily sensitive, that registers frequencies of information the analytical mind was not designed to detect, and communicates that information through sensations, impulses, resistances, and expansions that, when read with appropriate attention, are among the most reliable signs available to a human being. The gut feeling is the most widely acknowledged of these somatic communications, and yet also among the most frequently overridden. That specific sensation in the solar plexus, the contraction that says no before any reason has been given, the expansion that says yes before any argument has been made, is the body translating a signal from a layer of intelligence deeper than conscious thought. When the gut responds to a person, a situation, or a decision with a quality of knowing that precedes understanding, that response is a sign. It is the universe speaking through the instrument built into the physical body specifically for this purpose. The sudden and unexplained fatigue that descends in the middle of a path that looks correct from the outside is another form of somatic sign. The body registering a misalignment between the external direction and the soul's actual orientation, and communicating that misalignment in the most direct available terms by withdrawing the energy that authentic alignment provides. Energy follows alignment. When the energy is not following the direction deserves examination. Conversely, the inexplicable surge of aliveness in the presence of something not yet consciously claimed, this is the body recognizing alignment before the mind has caught up, saying yes to something the soul already knows belongs on the path. Learning to read the body's signs requires the same quality of receptive attention that reading any other form of cosmic communication requires: the willingness to pause, to feel into the sensation without immediately explaining it, to ask what it knows rather than immediately trying to make it stop. The body that is treated as an intelligent partner in navigation becomes one of the most reliable guidance systems a soul can access. It is always present, It is always responding. And it is always, in its own precise and physical language, saying something true. The cost of the closed door, you refuse to see. No one looks away from signs because they are indifferent to their own life. People look away because receiving signs fully would require change. And change, even when deeply wanted in the abstract, is threatening in the specific. It threatens the coherence of the current identity, the security of the current plan, the relationships built around the current version of the self. The mind constructs walls that look exactly like logic, and behind those walls, the signs accumulate, unopened, like letters addressed precisely to you that were never allowed past the door. The cost arrives slowly. There is no sudden dramatic announcement that the closed door has exacted its price. It accumulates quietly, in the texture of daily experience, in the growing sense that something is slightly off, slightly misaligned, slightly not quite the life the soul came here to live. A feeling that cannot be located precisely because it is not in any one place. It is diffused through everything, in the flatness that settles over accomplishments that should feel more meaningful, in the persistent sense of searching for something that cannot quite be named, in the distance between the self that moves through the world and the self that watches from somewhere deeper, knowing that the surface and the depth are not telling the same story. When intuition is repeatedly dismissed, something specific begins to happen in the internal architecture of a person. The signal does not disappear, but the capacity to receive it clearly weakens. Like a muscle never used, the fluency diminishes by degrees so small they are not noticed until the loss has become substantial. There comes a point where a person cannot easily distinguish between the voice of genuine inner knowing and the voice of anxiety, because both have been grouped together under the broad category of irrational response. And this is one of the most profound losses that can befall a human being. Not the loss of an opportunity or a relationship, but the loss of fluent access to the part of oneself that always knew the way. The philosopher Seneca observed that the person who does not know which port they are sailing toward will find no wind favorable. The wind that the universe provides is not absent. It is always present. But it can only carry a soul that has set a heading, and the heading can only be set by attending to the signals that the universe uses to point the way. Every dismissal makes a small deposit into the account of self-distrust. The inner voice becomes slightly less credible. The inner knowing becomes slightly more suspect, until the soul's communications arrive in a form so foreign to the mind's habitual operating mode that they are not even registered as communications at all, but simply as noise, as the emotional static of a system that needs to be better managed. This is the deepest cost. Not the missed opportunity, not the unchosen direction, but the loss of fluent access to the part of oneself that was always navigating by something true. The cycle that keeps repeating. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs specifically to the person who has watched the same pattern arrive in their life for the third time, or the fifth, or the 10th, wearing a different costume, speaking with a different voice, arriving through circumstances so genuinely different on the surface that it is genuinely surprising when the familiar emotional territory reveals itself beneath. The same dynamic in a new relationship, the same professional crisis in a new company, the same wound, reactivated by a different hand, the same self-abandonment at the same kind of crossroads. This exhaustion carries within it one of the most important questions a soul can ask. Why does this keep happening? Not as self-punishment, but as genuine inquiry into the intelligence behind the repetition. Because the cycle is not random. It has architecture. It is the universe's escalated curriculum, the lesson delivered and not yet received, dressed in successive costumes until the costume changing itself becomes undeniable. The law of cause and effect, operating at the level of the soul's development, states that a pattern will continue until the cause behind it is addressed. Not the surface cause, not the specific person or circumstance that triggered the most recent iteration, but the root cause, the internal state, the unexamined belief, the unhealed wound that keeps generating the conditions for the same experience to recur. This is not punishment. It is the most efficient teaching methodology available to a universe committed to the soul's evolution. The lesson is delivered in the simplest form first. When the simplest form is not sufficient, a more intense one follows. The escalation continues until the lesson lands at the depth required. The person who understands this about cycles does not ask how to make the cycle stop. They ask what the cycle is teaching. They bring the quality of honest, non-defensive inquiry to the question of what internal condition is generating the external pattern. And this inquiry, when it is genuine and sustained, is itself the beginning of the resolution. The cycle is not a prison. It is a classroom with a door that opens from the inside, and the key is the willingness to look directly at what the cycle has been trying to show, without retreating into the explanation that this time it was simply the wrong person, or the wrong timing or bad luck in a universe that occasionally generates it. What the universe is protecting you from. There is a closed door in your history that, at the time of its closing, felt like one of the worst things that had ever happened to you. A relationship that ended before you were ready. An opportunity that collapsed despite your best efforts. A plan that fell apart with a thoroughness that felt personal. In the moment of that closing, the thought that it might be protection probably did not arrive easily, if it arrived at all. Pain at that scale tends to generate the opposite interpretation, the feeling of abandonment, of misfortune, of a universe that is either indifferent or actively unkind. But consider what you can see from here, from the distance of time. The relationship that ended, where did the path you were on with that person lead, given what you know now? The opportunity that collapsed. What would your life look like if it had succeeded on the terms you wanted it to at the time? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the actual questions of a soul beginning to read its own history as a series of communications rather than a series of random events. And the answers, when approached honestly, almost always reveal something remarkable. The universe can see further than the present moment allows. From where you stand, the view is necessarily partial. The information available to the deciding mind is the information of the present moment, filtered through the emotional state of the present moment. The information available to the intelligence behind the signs includes the full arc, not just where you are, but where the current direction leads. When the universe closes a door, it is because it can see what is behind that door in a way the soul, from its current vantage point, cannot. The closed door is not the universe saying no to you. It is the universe saying yes to something you cannot yet see, clearing the space, redirecting the trajectory, insisting on the path the soul itself originally chose, even when the current iteration of the self has forgotten that choice. The understanding of divine timing, preserved across wisdom traditions as the recognition that events arrive, not when the human will demands them, but when the fullness of readiness has been achieved, is directly relevant here. The door that closes is often closing not because what it leads to is wrong, but because the timing is wrong, because the soul has not yet developed what it needs in order to receive what is behind it, without losing itself in the receiving. The universe withholds not to punish but to prepare, and the preparation period, which from the inside can feel like deprivation, is from the outside the precise calibration of the conditions required for the soul to arrive at the next threshold, with what it needs to cross it. The turning point. Every soul eventually reaches. There is a moment, and it does not announce itself in advance, does not arrive with ceremony or obvious significance, when the accumulated weight of living in resistance to the universe's communication becomes simply, unmistakably, heavier than the discomfort of finally turning to face what has been calling. This moment is different for every soul. For one person, it comes in a moment of unexpected stillness, a morning when the habitual noise of the mind is briefly, inexplicably absent, and into that absence comes something that has always been there, waiting. For another, it comes through a crisis that strips away every defense the mind has been maintaining, leaving the soul with nothing between itself and the truth it has been carrying. For another, it comes quietly, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary day, as a gentle and somehow final recognition that the way things have been cannot continue as the way things will be. What is common across all of these moments is the specific quality of the recognition they carry. It is not a feeling of failure or defeat. It is something closer to relief, the particular relief that belongs to the moment when the effort of pretending something is not true is finally released, when the energy directed toward maintaining a particular version of reality can finally be redirected toward living in the actual reality of what is. The turning point is not the moment the soul gives up. It is the moment the soul gives over the burden of fighting its own navigation, the exhausting project of overriding its own knowing, the tremendous cost of living at a permanent angle to what it genuinely perceives. The Stoic philosophers taught that the person who rages against what cannot be changed is far less free than the person who accepts it with full awareness and acts from that acceptance. They spoke of this turning point as the moment the soul reclaims its sovereignty, not the sovereignty of control over circumstances, but the sovereignty of orientation. The soul's right to meet its circumstances with clarity rather than resistance, with presence rather than avoidance, with the specific dignity of a being that has remembered what it is and chosen, with full awareness to act accordingly. This turning point is available at any moment. It is available in this one. It does not require that the circumstances be right, that the path be clear, that the resistance have been fully resolved before the turn is made. Waiting for those conditions is itself a form of resistance. The turning point happens not when the conditions invite it, but when the soul decides it is time, and the soul that feels, somewhere beneath the familiar comfortable weight of the status quo, that familiar stirring of something true. That soul is standing at the edge of its own turning point right now. How to begin listening again. The soul that has spent significant time in the habit of dismissing signs does not restore its fluency overnight. It is not a single dramatic act of surrender. It is not a one-time decision that produces immediate and complete fluency with the language of the universe. It is a practice, a returning, a daily, moment-by-moment reorientation toward the quality of attention that allows the subtle to be received alongside the obvious, that treats the inner knowing as trustworthy rather than suspect, that meets the ordinary moments of a day with the quiet readiness of a soul that expects, with good reason, to find communication in them. The first and most foundational step is the practice of pausing, not meditating, not withdrawing from ordinary life, not adding one more obligation to an already full day. Simply pausing. In the middle of the moment when something is felt, a sensation in the body, a resonance in a word heard in passing, the mild but persistent pull of attention toward something with no obvious practical reason to be interesting, pausing long enough to feel into it rather than immediately moving past it. The pause is the opening. The pause is the act that says to the soul's knowing, I am here. I am listening. The restoration of trust in inner perception follows. This trust is restored not through argument or affirmation, but through the accumulation of small acts of following. When the gut response is felt and followed, and the following produces an outcome that confirms the quality of the information, even in small ways, in low-stakes situations, the trust rebuilds. The soul that begins following its own knowing in the small decisions creates the internal evidence base that makes it possible to trust that knowing in the larger ones. Keeping a simple record of signs and their correspondence with significant inner states is one of the most practical tools available. Not an elaborate spiritual journal. Simply the habit of noting when a sign is noticed, what was happening internally at the moment of its arrival. Over time, the patterns that emerge reveal the specific vocabulary the universe has been using for this particular soul. The restoration of listening also requires the deliberate creation of stillness, not as formal spiritual discipline, but as the regular creation of space in which the quieter communications can be heard. The mind that is perpetually occupied creates an internal environment in which only the loudest signals can penetrate. The universe prefers to speak quietly, and a life arranged to never be quiet is, in effect, a life arranged to never fully receive what the universe most wants to say. Alignment is not a destination. One of the most quietly damaging misconceptions in conversations about spiritual alignment is the idea that it is a state to be achieved, a level of clarity and peace that, once reached, constitutes arrival. That somewhere ahead, if the work is done and the signs are followed and the resistance is released, there is a fixed point of alignment that can be inhabited permanently, after which navigation becomes simple and communication becomes clear and life flows in continuous, uncomplicated ease. This expectation creates a specific and recurring form of spiritual discouragement. The feeling of having failed every time the clarity becomes temporary or the connection requires renewal. Alignment is not a destination. It is a direction. It is a living, dynamic, continuously unfolding relationship between the soul and the intelligence behind the signs. A relationship that, like all genuine relationships, requires presence, attention, and the willingness to continue choosing it even when the choosing is not convenient or immediately rewarded. The aligned life is not the life without difficulty. It is the life in which the soul has chosen with ongoing and active intention to move with the current rather than against it. The Hermetic principle known as the principle of rhythm teaches that everything moves in cycles, tides of expansion and contraction, clarity and confusion, felt connection and apparent distance that are not evidence of failure, but of the natural oscillation of a living system. The soul in genuine alignment is not exempt from these rhythms. It moves through them. There are periods when the signs are abundant and clear, and there are periods when the signs are quieter, when the direction is less obvious, when the guidance requires more patient attention to receive. Both of these periods are part of alignment. The contraction is as much a part of the cycle as the expansion. The soul that understands this does not interpret the quiet periods as evidence of having lost the connection. It interprets them as part of the rhythm, the intake before the next breath, the fallow period before the next growth. Rather than scrambling to restore the felt sense of connection through increased spiritual effort, it receives the quiet period with open hands and patient attention, with the foundational trust that the conversation has not ended, only deepened into a register that requires more stillness to hear. Alignment is also not the elimination of desire or the transcendence of human experience. The aligned soul grieves. It wants. It fears. What changes is not the presence of these experiences, but the quality with which they are held. The awareness that even the most difficult of them is embedded in a larger intelligence that is not indifferent to what is being felt. You were always meant to receive this. There is something happening in you right now, in the quiet space behind these words that is worth naming. Not the intellectual processing. The mind has been active throughout, noting and filing and generating its responses. Not the emotional response, though that has been present too, surfacing at specific moments of recognition as the sensation of something familiar being confirmed rather than something new being introduced. What is happening beneath those layers is something quieter and older and more significant. It is the soul experiencing the specific quality of recognition that belongs to remembering rather than learning. The recognition of something that was always already known. You were always meant to receive this message, not this video in particular, but the understanding it carries, the permission it extends, the confirmation that the signs you have been seeing are real, that the language you have been sensing at the edges of your ordinary experience is genuine, that the universe has never stopped communicating with you for a single moment of your life. The path that brought you here, including the dismissals, the detours, the cycles that repeated, and the doors that closed and the seasons when the signs were ignored until they had to become louder. All of it was part of the same journey. None of it was wasted. None of it was outside the design. The soul contract made before this life began included this moment. The people who taught you about dismissal taught you something necessary. The pain that felt purposeless was pointing somewhere real. The cycles that exhausted you were developing something that simple instruction could not have developed. The specific quality of readiness built only through repeated encounter with the same material until it is genuinely understood rather than intellectually acknowledged. Near-death experience accounts, studied across cultures and decades with remarkable consistency, carry one phrase that recurs with a frequency researchers in the field have found extraordinary. Nothing was wasted. Everything counted. Every moment of the life lived, including the painful ones, including the confused ones, including those that felt most like failure or abandonment. Every moment was part of the design. Every moment was being worked with, by the intelligence behind it all, toward the development of something the soul itself had chosen to become. You are not a person who received a message today. You are a soul that remembered a conversation that has always been happening. The universe did not begin speaking to you when you pressed play. It has been speaking to you since before you knew you were capable of hearing. What changes now is not the universe's communication. It has always been there. What changes is the quality of your reception, the willingness to pause at the number that keeps appearing and ask what it knows rather than how to explain it away, the willingness to sit with the feeling that will not resolve and ask where it is pointing rather than how to make it stop, the willingness to treat the people who arrive at threshold moments as sent, the doors that close as protective, the cycles that repeat as intelligent. The signs will continue. They are already here in this moment as you complete this message. The direction your thoughts move in the silence after these words end, that is a sign. The feeling in your body as you sit with what has been said, that is a sign. They do not stop. They have never stopped. But from this moment, you meet them as the fluent soul you have always been, reading the language you were always meant to read, in conversation with an intelligence that has never, not for one single moment, been anything other than entirely devoted to guiding you home. Peace is not waiting on the other side of understanding every sign perfectly. Peace is here, in the soul that has remembered its own fluency. It has always been here. And now, finally, you have stopped looking for it somewhere else long enough to recognize it in the place it has always lived, in the quiet, certain, sovereign center of a soul that knows it is in conversation with something that loves it, that has always loved it, and that will never stop finding ways to make that love known. You are always going to find your way back to this. The universe knew it, and somewhere in the part of you that has been listening not with your mind but with something older and more steady, you have always known it too.